We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Mary Inman. She's a partner at Constantine Cannon LLP. Mary, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Absolutely. Well, it's really a delight to be on with you, Christina. I'm a big fan of AllVoices, which I think is the best name for a company like yours. I go by the she, her pronouns, and I'm a partner at Constantine Cannon. I actually head our international whistleblower practice. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute. But when I was growing up, I am dating myself. I answered the question of what do you want to be when you grow up by the virtue of the fact that I saw that Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor had just made broken the glass ceiling and was the first woman on the Supreme Court. And as we all know, those kinds of milestones are really important. It seemed feasible to me. So as a very young person, I decided that I wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. So hats off to Sandra Day O'Connor.
I love that. I love what inspires us and kind of motivates us to get us into this work. I think it's an interesting question to ask where we think we'd be kind of 10, 20 years down the line. I have a lot of questions about your day-to-day. I want to start off by asking why it's really important to create intentional safe spaces for individuals to speak up and why it's important specifically to create a healthy company culture. If you have any kind of data you've seen really support that.
Yeah, it's vital to an organization's health, not just their health, but actually their profitability, to create environments where whistleblowers and other people who have the temerity to speak up, who want to bring information about potential wrongdoings, they're actually your eyes and ears, and without them, you're flying blind. And it's not easy to speak up. We have all seen this in our relationships, right? It's hard to call out your partner or someone else for bad behavior, right? It's easier to just go along and get along, but it's that role as a risk management tool that whistleblowers play that it's vital that you allow them to be there and feel comfortable to talk about things that they see that's going on wrong or how you could do things better. I mean, why don't we all want to be better? I think we want to encourage really robust conversations because I think we're all better when we have those kinds of conversations. In terms of research, there's been some amazing research coming out of George Washington University and the University of Utah, where two professors were given access to a huge data set by a whistleblower, an internal reporting mechanism provider. And what they saw is something that is incredibly revelatory. They basically saw that companies who have active internal reporting mechanisms, ones where if it's the hotline, it's ringing off the hook, they are actually healthier, more profitable, have fewer investigations, have fewer lawsuits than ones who don't, whose hotline is essentially silent. You would think that's counterintuitive, right? You would think that means, oh, well, if no one's talking, then there's no problem. What that really means is that if no one's talking, no one feels comfortable to talk. So to me, that has been incredibly groundbreaking research in terms of inspiring and actually telling people with empirical data that actually listening to whistleblowers actually improves your bottom line. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the profitable thing to do.
Exactly. It's not just a nice to have and a need to have. And that's something that we definitely believe in as well. Just because you're not receiving feedback or you see people talking does not mean everything is perfect and dandy. You really want people to feel like they are psychologically safe as well. When we're talking about empowering folks to speak up or kind of whistleblowers to at an organization, people might think of the compliance or legal team at an organization, especially for people who aren't really familiar with the work of compliance officers or teams working with them on a regular basis. What is the unique role of the chief compliance officer?
Yeah, so compliance officers are very underappreciated and misunderstood, I think, or not understood in the way that they should be. I have a very unique perspective on compliance officers because obviously my role is in exclusively for over 25 years. I've dedicated my career to representing whistleblowers and basically helping them get to government authorities who actually pay them for that information. As we know, in the United States, there's the SEC program, there's the CFTC program, the Department of Justice has a program under the False Claims Act. So what is really, really important here is that compliance officers are a lot like whistleblowers, right? They're delivering the hard truths. Their job is not a profit center. They're not necessarily a profit center. They're there to make sure that we're being compliant with all the rules and regulations. And so while you've got a lot of startups and other folks who just want to move fast and break things, that's the Silicon Valley way, it's really important that you recognize that you also need people who are watching out for the best interests of the company. So compliance officers and whistleblowers are aligned because they both are delivering sometimes hard news. And it's actually been a great development for my clients, and I would also say for companies in general, that compliance officers have started to really be advocates for whistleblowers because they start to see this similarity. So as the fate of the compliance officer rises, and we've seen the rising in the wake of many, many scandals, right? You hear all of from Enron to Theranos, there's so many different scandals, and you say, where were the compliance officers? We know that they were talking. So there's a real movement to elevate the role of the compliance officer up into more of a board level type position where they aren't so quickly, easily silenced. And so I think my view of compliance officers is very much like whistleblowers, delivering hard news, but are really there for the company's best interests. And do a lot of work of science and other things and trying to figure out how can we create a healthy ecosystem for company culture where people feel free to talk.
Absolutely. We want to create that intentional culture that is a healthy ecosystem with a lot of folks being part of that kind of company culture as well. And thank you for outlining that context behind chief compliance officers and teams. We've mentioned kind of that if somebody thinks of a whistleblower hotline, it might be a little bit old school. What are kind of patterns you're seeing in the fundamental shift in traditional whistleblower hotlines to more modern approaches to really getting that ongoing feedback in a similar kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest development I've seen from the traditional literal hotline where you're picking up the phone is some fabulous tech solutions where you can really generate the trust and protection of the anonymity of the whistleblower from inception. Because my experience with my whistleblower clients is that it's hard to speak up, and they'll often send up a trial balloon just to test you, right? Before they tell you what they really want to tell you, they often set up a trial balloon. And so what I've seen in the creation of better and more highly evolved whistleblower reporting mechanisms, internal reporting mechanisms, is the ability to report anonymously at inception. And what that doesn't mean it has to stay anonymous throughout, but for those first initial communications, you can have your own little, I know that they often sometimes put up your own identity that you're an animal, right? You're the kangaroo or something. And so you as the kangaroo could start speaking via text, via messaging, and start sending up those trial balloons, seeing what the responses are. And then I think a lot of the time, depending how their concerns are addressed, they will ultimately reveal their identities. But at the beginning, it's really risky until you've engendered that trust. And so I feel like the tech has grown in a way to allow conversations to happen in a safer place, anonymized until you get to that later place. It used to be where you just dropped a white envelope right on your manager's desk, and there's no chance for dialogue and that kind of thing. So I feel like we're getting a lot better, just both the tech and realizing the psychology of what it means for someone to go against the grain and say something that might be unpopular.
Absolutely. And it goes to really continually building that trust, continuing the conversation as well. And you're right, people do de-anonymize, they feel comfortable and moving forward and taking those next steps too. And there's a huge opportunity with technology to really operationalize and make sure you're offering those opportunities and avenues for folks as well to really speak up and share their experiences. You have experience with a high profile case we were discussing on our kind of pre-call. That people may be familiar with in terms of there's a lot going on here in terms of ethics, entrepreneurship, and really corporate governance. And we've talked about it a little bit, but can you share a couple learnings from that as well?
Yeah, so I have the real pleasure to represent Tyler Schultz, one of the several whistleblowers who helped expose the Theranos fraud with Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. And there are just a lot of lessons to be learned from that. One of the first lessons that I think is interesting is the role of whistleblowers having a fellow whistleblower, sort of having solidarity. When you start, so as we know with the case of Theranos, they were the darling of Wall Street, right? She was on the Elizabeth on the cover of Forbes. Everybody thought they were the next big thing. So it's really hard to be that person who's going to sort of want to put a black eye on that image, and especially a company that is incredibly well resourced and incredibly powerful. And so I think one of the dynamics to take away from the Theranos case is the role that actually Tyler and Erica played for each other in emboldening one another. Because remember, I think what often happens with reporters, and we've seen this front and center with the Me Too movement, is if you're just the first one, it's very easy to gaslight you, right? It's all, and a lot of my clients suffer that crisis of confidence because, they start to report and then everyone closes ranks behind them. And then all of a sudden it's all about them. We like to shoot the messenger to divert attention from the message. And so I think there's a really important role for allowing multiple people who see the same problems to be able to link arms and embolden each other. So I think that's one of the stories about Theranos, I think, is the role of Tyler and Erica to help support one another. I think one of the biggest lessons is in terms of red flags that came out of that scenario is how siloed everything was, right? It was by design that they didn't want there to be a free-flowing exchange of information. So they were very purposeful in keeping people from talking. That's a huge red flag. Another big red flag for fraud and problems, of course, is in a corporate governance sense, is the fact that her board of directors was a who's list of former generals and secretaries of states, with Henry Kissinger, Tyler's grandfather, George Shultz, and then also General Petraeus and more. But none of them had any experience in biotech. So again, I think you have to think really creatively that board's role is there to, they're not employed by the company, right? They're there to ask the tough questions. It's hard to ask the tough questions if you don't have any expertise in the area. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the Theranos scandal, but those are a few of my highlights reels.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that kind of flow of information, really looking at kind of the senior leadership level, the board of directors, and kind of looking at how we can collectively help one another is really important too. You mentioned kind of the board of directors in terms of the chief compliance officer and kind of the role they have there as well. What are you seeing in terms of the roles of board of directors and asking for newer metrics and health and growth in the organization, maybe that they haven't asked for before, but now they're looking to? If you could provide any kind of examples for folks who are listening.
Yeah, I mean, I've been seeing a lot going on that's really, to me, heartening about how boards are improving their roles. There's been so many scandals and the boards were kind of asleep at the switch. So I think there has been a reawakening of trying to take stock. I think one of the really important ways for that boards can, and one of the companies that I think is really interesting, and it goes to AllVoices' name, is that State Street Bank has really singled out itself as really pushing for diverse voices on the board. So we've seen this early on, we saw some fabulous research that talked about companies that have women on their boards, not just a token woman, but multiple women, are more profitable or more effective. We're seeing that with people of color. So I think one of the biggest things we're seeing is boards taking to heart this notion that it's not just a good thing to do DE and I, it's actually helpful to the company. And so I feel like a trend that I'm seeing, and I think State Street Bank has certainly led the way in this area, certainly as to really pushing to have women on their boards, is really important. And the reason I highlight this is that the research we talked about earlier about whistleblowers actually also being diverse voices, ones that actually help the company, is I think the more that we think about them in that way, that research is just the same, that you're bringing people with different backgrounds, right? The more people with different backgrounds and different experience, the better that we'll get to a result, right? That's just proven. And so I think that really has to be reflected on boards. So I actually would like to see boards hiring or bringing on former whistleblowers. Think about Tyler Schultz to be on a bunch of different boards in Silicon Valley. So should Erica Chung, right? Not just having women and people of color, that's really important, but also having people you want to emulate and model.
Absolutely.
Model the good behavior.
Model that good behavior, have that experience. And I want to touch on further advice you would have for startups to really create an environment of high trust and intentional feedback early on, because we know that it's never too early to really start this work. It doesn't matter if you have 1 to 10 people, and then you continue to grow because you're manifesting that culture. So what advice do you have for those folks?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's exciting to be thinking about starting from inception, creating the environment where people feel safe to speak up, right? And having the right corporate governance principles. So not coincidentally, Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz have created a nonprofit called Ethics and Entrepreneurship. And it is actually designed to do just that. So there's no better time than starting with inception. That's when you start to create a corporate culture. It's hard to wind back that culture once it's been created, right? Look at Theranos. Like, can you imagine how Theranos would have been if from inception there was an environment of, we want to hear from you, we want to hear good, bad, and indifferent kind of things. So that, I think that startups have a unique opportunity because remember, when they start, like you said, you've got 10 people, but those 10 people, if it turns into the next PayPal or the next Google, those are some of the most important voices, right? And now you've set a tone where it's clear that the people that you hire after that will start modeling this behavior too. So it's never too soon. In fact, it's really vital. And there's a really interesting woman who's a whistleblower herself, and she's based in the UK now. And one of the ways that companies can really help this from inception is we don't come out of the womb knowing how to have difficult conversations. Like, she has created, and I think she's in the process of doing a VR headset where you start to practice having what she calls courageous conversations. Her name is Wendy Addison. And I think that's just right. I think a startup should be having a day where you model and role model everything. We do this in sexual harassment training sometimes. That's some of the best kind of training that we do at companies. But why can't we do this about someone, who is hiding something that, someone doesn't want to sign a particular certification about the books and records because they're worried about someone's hiding something, right? How do we have that conversation with someone's more senior than you? I mean, I think there's a lot of work we can do from the very beginning, and let those conversations and learn and practice how to do it, and how to do it in a way that your voices can be heard, and do it. We always talk about speak up, but on the other side of that equation is listen up. So we need to have the skills of how do we listen and how do we respond when someone is doing that. So I just feel like there's a lot of skill development that needs to happen, and no better time to do that than at the very beginning.
Absolutely. How do we listen up? How do we provide that opportunity? And then what are we going to do about it? How do we effectively communicate that we heard you as well? And then that doesn't mean, what if there is conflict or there is disagreement, it's not a bad thing. Just how do you lean into those kind of difficult conversations as well? It's a skill like anything else that you need to practice in order to be comfortable with it and also engage in these conversations instead of being silent or going with the title there. Mary, is there anything that I didn't ask you in our conversation today that you want to kind of highlight, or 1 to 2 key insights you hope people really bring with them as well when we're talking about trust, speak up culture, and starting early on?
Yeah, I have two insights, I think. The first one is one that I think is interesting because it really touches on my profession and the role that I have in representing whistleblowers, which is that companies really need to take stock of the fact that if they're not listening, that there are increasingly attractive options for whistleblowers moving forward in terms of going external. So if you're not listening to them when they're trying to report to you externally, there are obviously the programs that I talked about that I represent my clients under, where the SEC, the Department of Justice pay whistleblowers 10 to 30% of any recovery that they get based on the information that the whistleblower had. There's also increasingly really savvy media and other folks who will also tell a whistleblower story. And we're seeing a lot of outlets. I think a lot of fear is around defamation, and that whistleblowers will be too scared to speak out because of defamation type lawsuits. But we're still seeing increasingly some pretty savvy media groups, and even in the case of Frances Haugen at Facebook, a real huge community being brought around her to support her, from everything from a really great legal team to great PR folks, to great media people, to great psychosocial support. So I would just caution companies to really be listening, and not just rest on their laurels, because there's a lot of us out there who want to hear it, including the feds, if you don't want to hear it. And so the sobering statistic I like to tell everyone is that the SEC always reports annually the data from its Dodd-Frank whistleblower reward program. Year over year, they have a figure that about 80% of all whistleblowers who receive rewards under their program reported internally first. What does this say? It says that there's a huge failure. And there's other statistics that say whistleblowers don't just try once to speak up. It's like they tried 2, 3, 4, on average 4 or 5 times, with multiple different people. So it's, a lot of this is showing just a very serious failing on companies. So I just would like to give those sobering figures. And ending on a positive note, less of a sobering note. The last thing I'd like to say is that I would really encourage people to think about a pretty revolutionary idea, I think, which is to actually think about hiring whistleblowers. We obviously have the Great Resignation. We have a shortage of really talented, qualified people. And I think we need to start thinking about whistleblowers as what they really are, which is not only are they not disloyal, they're some of your most loyal employees. Like, who but a loyal employee has the fortitude to basically tell you something that's difficult to hear? Only people who care about the organization do that. So we just have a lot of extraordinary whistleblowers out there who are not employed because we always say they have a scarlet W often. And I just think it's an enormous brain drain. And that I think a number of companies would do incredibly well in terms of that signaling we were talking about. If you were a startup and you hired, not just put Tyler Schultz on your board, but you put him as one of your employee number ones, that really sends a signal in terms of what you value as a company.
Absolutely. Modeling that behavior and really walking the walk, talking the talk, having that alignment there, and really starting that culture early on as well. Mary, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Christina, thank you so much for having me. Like I said, AllVoices says it all. Your name tells us that you are recognizing all voices, that those voices are the most important thing to any company, is to have those voices heard.
Absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really do believe in both employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.